Shards of Darkness, Resurrected and Ready for Revenge, by Vaughan Farrar. Prologue. End of an Era. Light drops of sprinkled rain fell from darkened clouds, swallowing the sky in a swirling storm. Pattered droplets echoed across the moorlands, splashing off the crumbled armors of 200 men and women lying amidst their own blood and muck. Surrounded by her fallen army, the exhausted Commander Aribald dropped to her knees, her metal-plated shell rustling atop her, trembling. "How could this have happened?" she asked, her lips a-quiver. If I hadn't seen it with my own 2 eyes, I would have never believed that you could have done this, any of this, alone." Her breath leapt from her throat as the crunch of a skull beneath a steel boot cracked across the sea of dead soldiers. A tall, dark figure, clad in black-plated armor as jagged and menacingly coarse as the man who wore it, stalked towards the commander with no regards for the corpses beneath his stride. When the squelching, crackled footsteps had stopped, her weary gaze was met with a heavy iron boot covered in blood and entrails pressing down upon her blade. With nothing but fear left in her sunken heart, the commander lifted her shaky head with a feigned scowl to look upon the monster. His entire body was covered in thick, rigid metal, etched with twisted swirls that were akin to flame. Each piece of blackened plate had been meticulously shaped and forged to impose and instill dread into all those who gazed upon it. It was rough, wicked, and sharply pointed at every joint. It was not merely a suit of armor. It was a manifestation of cruelty in physical form, a trait its bearer gladly emblazoned. Before her eyes could meet his face, a sudden pain wrapped around her neck as his clawed gauntlet did the very same. The cold metal tightening on her windpipe left Aribald just enough airway for her to struggle for breath as she was slowly lifted off the ground. Kicking her legs, she couldn't reach him with his arm holding her out. She slammed her fist down onto his wrist, but it proved as useful as hitting a rock. Writhing and squirming as best she could, the commander had been lifted level with the face of her towering attacker. An abyss of darkness concealed his features beneath his helm. Adorned with 4 jagged horns of varying sizes, his head was shrouded in an iron skull with an open face, revealing only the glow of his fiery red eyes. The intensity of his gaze, barely visible beneath his helm's furrowed brow, was more than enough for Aribald to feel his stare pierce right through her soul. "Please," she pleaded, wheezing as her face turned blue. "Varkan, I beg of you." As if amused by the very mention of his name, the monster tilted his head slightly. It had felt like an eternity for Aribald when he finally spoke with a gravely sonorous voice. "This was fun. I'd suggest we do it again sometime, but, well, you know." With a loud crack echoing across the field of death, he had twisted his wrist and snapped her neck like a mere twig. "You're dead." Limp and lifeless, Varkan tossed the commander's body to the mud like a broken toy. Having mercilessly conquered the day, he turned to wade through the bodies and regroup with his 4 minions. Though his boots would clang with every step, inevitably kicking the armored corpses as he passed by, the sound was nothing compared to the clattering of metal being collected that he was trudging towards. Scooping heads out of helmets, pulling daggers out of chests, and collecting bits and pieces of swords from across the battlefield, his oddball minions were hard at work stockpiling all sorts of trinkets. They were feral little creatures known as graglins. Their sense of loyalty to the Dark Lord tells of a deeper connection, but one they tend to hold secret. With scaly snouts and serrated smiles, their faces are somewhat draconic in appearance, yet they are far smaller than any dragon of old. One could say that they are more akin to short goblins in stature and form, having ears that are just about as long, too. Be that as it may, their kind is feared across the realm, as the sight of a Graglin tends to foreshadow the presence of Varkan, or the bidding of his malicious will. A rumbling thunder rolled through the clouds, roaring as a bolt of lightning thrust through the storm to strike several bodies at the far end of the moorlands. Set ablaze with crackling flame, an awful smell of roasting flesh wafted through the air. A heavier rainfall was sure to follow. enough to douse the fire, but Lord Vaughan had no intentions to linger. Snapping his metal-clawed fingers, he gestured with a flurry of his wrist for the Graglin to gather all that they could carry and begin their journey back to Dread. Begrudgingly, they ceased toying with the dead like puppets and followed their master home, dragging their loot behind them. The heavy downpour eventually fell as Vaughan and his minions approached their monstrous abode, Castle Voidstone, a monument to the malevolence of ancient power past. A fortress of stone as black as night sits beyond the spiked rocks of the Serpent Overpass. A single spire rising from the keep pierced the storm like a darkened claw reaching up to crash the stars. Looming over all of Dread, it is a beacon of dread and despair for any and all who dare enter the wretched lands. The clamorous patter of heavy rain on cobblestone and mud concealed the sound of unfamiliar steps pursuing the Dark Lord and his minions. Four ominous figures endeavored to remain hidden behind the cover of coiling mist and shadow. Ducking and darting behind rugged boulders and dead trees, they remained unseen for the time being, waiting and watching. Though the storm over Dread was thick and merciless, just enough moonlight pierced the veil of darkness for the statues of horridly detailed and grotesque creatures sitting in the courtyard to glisten from the splashing water. Monstrous stone dragons spreading their wings leered down with the hunger in their eyes. Hellish creatures with dagger-filled beaks and razor claws looked to have been petrified in the midst of leaping to rip and tear. There were even statues of serpents coiled and ready to attack with a fanged bite. All of them looked to be frozen in time and turned to stone, with a rather eerie, lifelike resemblance. Walking past the statues, the subtle sound of a crisp leaf crunching beneath a leather boot caught the twitching ear of one of the Graglin, the female in particular. Her senses were a little more attuned compared to that of her brothers. She turned her scaly head toward those lurking behind, whilst the other three continued to follow their master, oblivious to anything and everything as they headed for the castle gates. The curious Graglin detoured back to investigate the odd noise. Upon reaching the gnarled rotten tree where she thought the sound had come from, she looked around with narrowed eyes only to see an empty darkness. Circling the trunk and inspecting the branches above, she expected to see something or someone climbing up, but again, there was nothing. Looking into the swirling mist and the raining abyss around her once more, the Graglin shrugged, convinced that there was nothing to be alarmed of. Taking a single step back toward the castle, the Graglin was abruptly interrupted by a massive iron hammer smashing through her skull and splattering her brains, along with an eye and several teeth onto the bark of the gnarled tree. A tall, green-skinned woman stood, hammer in hand, delighted in her nasty work, but quickly found herself struggling to remove the weapon from the wood it was now deeply embedded in. "Oh, come on," she growled. Whistling through the rain, an arrow flew straight past her face, headed directly for Vaughan's neck. Alas, before it was even close to making contact with the back of his helm, he swiped the arrow out of the air and snapped it betwixt his claws, much like the commander's neck earlier. Looking over his shoulder with a deathly glare, his eyes met with four distinct figures ready at arms by the trees where the green woman's hammer was still lodged. "That doesn't count as a miss, right?" asked Tylandra, the young archer. Her hooded cape bellowed in the wind as she stepped forward. A burly man then stepped next to her, donning a clean set of silver knight armor and brandishing a hefty-looking longsword. "I mean, you kind of hit his gauntlet. Sort of," he shrugged. "Can we focus?" asked a shorter man with a dark complexion, dressed in burgundy warlock robes. "I'm shocked we're not dead already." "Cheer up, Doromin," said the knight. "You'll kill the mood." He would have rolled his eyes, but Doromin's gaze was fixed upon the remaining Graglins. Their teeth were bared in snarling grimaces as their brows lowered over their reptilian eyes. They seemed to have been quite riled by their sister's sudden demise and were visibly shaking like a pack of Kager canines ready to attack. "Go," Vaughan whispered, and all three Graglin leapt into a storming sprint of unbridled fury toward their prey. "Here they come!" Tylindra yelled, hoping to have alerted the War Maiden with her hammer stuck in the tree. The knight charged forward, hoping to meet the feral beast with a swing of his blade, but they pounded right over him and his weapon. Graglin were quite nimble for their stocky little figures. The knight was shocked by their dexterity, but more so when the sole of one of their scaly-clawed feet stepped off his face to launch themselves a little further. Stumbling back and turning around, he yelled, "Lash! Look out!" as the Graglin ignored both Doromin and Tylandra. Instead, they charged straight for the green woman still attempting to retrieve her weapon from the tree. Wanting to aid his companion, the knight began to retreat, but was stopped by Doromin's hand. "Nerigolt!" he cried. "Lashog can handle herself. This might be our only chance. We can't waste it." Gripping the hilt of his longsword tighter with ire, Nerigolt's mind bounced back and forth. "She's unarmed and outnumbered," he thought. "I can't just abandon my friend, but I need to help the other two with Varkon. But surely the right thing to do would be to turn back and help Lash." Looking through the veil of pouring rain, however, Lashog was naturally holding her own, brawling with the draconic little terror and actually beating them. Sure, they had managed to scratch her over her eye and tear off a few chunks of her leather armor here and there, but she was kicking ass in the battle of 3-on-1. For every Graglin face she punched, she kicked another in their shins. For every bite the Graglin gave, she slammed another down to the ground and twisted their arm. For every claw they swiped at her body, she threw an uppercut into the Graglin's jaw. Lashog barely looked to have broken a sweat. "Fair enough," Nerigolt nodded. He swiftly turned toward Varkon with his companions to make their advance. "An army of your strongest men and women lie dead at the foot of Fang Mountains by my hand alone. What possible death wish could the four of you have?" asked Varkon effortlessly, repelling another arrow with his mace. Feeling a slight spur of frenzy wash over him, Nerigolt gritted his teeth, clenched his sword, and charged straight at the Dark Lord himself. "Wait!" Doromin yelled, but it was too late. Varkon smashed his mace upward into the knight's armor before he could even swing his blade. It looked effortless on Varkon's behalf, but he hit Nerigolt with such a force that he was flung right back behind Doromin and Tylandra. The ground even catered upon him crashing down onto it. "Oh!" Dashing behind a fallen pillar, Tylandra drew arrow after arrow, letting them fly in quick succession. Tediously swatting them away with ease, Apathy was slowly taking Varkon. Through waving his gauntlet, he summoned a flash of purple smoke and conjured a small ethereal shield to repel the arrows effortlessly. "Was this really your plan?" the Dark Lord mocked. He stalked closer to his attackers like a lion to its prey. "A few arrows, an amateur knight, and whatever pajama boy over there is, a wizard want to be?" In his arrogance, Varkon overlooked Doromin snapping a spell stick to summon a large projectile of flame before he hurled it toward him. As one of his hands was already preoccupied with shielding himself from the barrage of arrows, the Dark Lord could only use his mace in an attempt to deflect the oncoming sorcery. Extending his weapon toward the ball of fire, Varkon intercepted it without strain. Wrapping the flames around the serrated flang of his mace, he twirled the fire around in a spiral as if it were some kind of liquid. Raising his burning weapon to the skies, he released the sorcery into a massive, fiery mushroom cloud that pierced a hole through the storming weather. The moon had given passage to shine through the scorched sky, basking Varkon in an infernal glow as if they were some kind of dark god. When he tried to lower his arm, however, he felt a tugging sensation keeping it raised above his head. There appeared to be some kind of ethereal chain wrapped around his wrist, holding it in place. Looking to his assailants for clarity, he saw that the green woman was still busy brawling with his minions. The archer was still incessantly firing arrows at his shield, to which he thought that she would run out at some point. The wannabe wizard had somehow set himself on fire. The knight, who had foolishly charged him before, however, had Varkon rolling his eyes. There he was, standing firm with something glowing within his gauntlet. A runestone. Seriously, you think that the pitiful sorcery of a runestone can hold me? Vaughan sighed with disappointment. He then lowered his conjured shield to free his hand and allowed Tylandra's arrows to fly and bounce right off his rigid armor. His efforts to procure a shield in the first place seemed almost in vain at that point, as the arrows would have never been able to penetrate his hellish shell anyway. "Once I snap this chain, your pathetic little stone will crumble, and then I will show you what true mastery of the arcane looks like," he growled. Stretching his gauntlet up to his confined wrist to tear the chain away, Vaughan was shocked to find a second chain wrapping around his left hand, binding it with the very same sorcery. The constant volley of arrows had ceased, smashing into the armor, and then he looked to see why. Vaughan spotted yet another runestone in Tylandra's hands. She then manipulated the stone in a way that forced Vaughan's arms to point down to the ground beside him. "All right. Now you're just pissing me off," he snarled, his red eyes burning brighter like flames of crimson through his helm. Pulling away from the chains with all of his might, the green ethereal links were stretching and shaking. The Dark Lord's strength was far greater than the four heroes had anticipated. They knew that he was incredibly strong, but he was mere moments away from snapping the accursed chains, a binding spell that was thought to be unbreakable by man with pure brute force or will. Even the runestones conjuring them were dwindling fast. "What's happening with the stones, Doramin?" Tylandra yelled. "They're just temporary conduits for rune sorcery. They enable anyone with the requisite knowledge to activate them the ability to unleash the potent spells engraved on their surface," Doramin replied. "Yeah, we know that. We did that, but why are they crumbling so fast?" Nurigold barked. "Well, the rune sorcery will only hold for as long as the conduit holds, and then they begin to gradually disintegrate upon use," the warlock whimpered in reply. "Could have mentioned that a little earlier," the knight scoffed. "Foolish mortals," Vaughan snarled. "No chains can withhold my wrath. No sorcery can surpass my power. No soul can save you now." Black smoke poured from beneath Vaughan's helm as he lowered his scaly jaw and began emitting a bright, fiery-looking light from the back of his throat. "Wait, what's he doing? And did he just call us mortals?" Nurigold winced. "Oh, this is gonna suck, isn't it?" The glow at the back of the Dark Lord's throat turned to a purple hue as the black fire erupted from his jaws and spewed forth towards Nurigold. "Black flames? He breathes fire and flames? That makes no sense. What the hell is this guy?" the knight exclaimed, hastily taking cover behind a statue. It was all that he could do to ensure his runestone remained active to keep Vaughan confined. "I don't know," Doramin yelled back. "But I do know that I can chain this big ugly face." The warlock tapped the surface of another stone to activate its rune and restrain the Dark Lord further. Another accursed chain appeared, whipping around his neck and wrapping over his mouth like a gag and noose, yanking his throat high. Struggling to breathe under his own weight pulling at his windpipe, Vaughan was forced to abstain his efforts of lowering his arm held high. His attempts to shatter the binds would have to wait a little while so that he could focus on breathing and relieving the pressure on his neck. "Hold on just a little longer," Doramin requested, a task far easier said than done. Due to Vaughan's immense power, his resistance against the chains was causing the runestones to evaporate at a faster rate than they had hoped. Nurigold's stone was nearly a pebble, and Tylandra's had 3 cracks forming through it. Lashog still had her hands full with the Graglins, so she was unable to help as originally planned. She had since lost more armor, the Graglins slowly tearing it off piece by piece. Looking a little worse for wear, blue blood dripped from her mouth and wounds, but she still had plenty more fight left in her. So too did the Graglins, although it seemed that they were looking rather beaten and pummeled with swollen limbs and puffy, bruised faces. They may only stand around 4 feet tall, but they were vicious fighters through and through. Doramin?" Tylandra called with concern. "We may have a problem here." Her runestone had fully cracked and crumbled to a sandy dust cascading through her fingers. As a result, Vaughan's left hand had been freed, and he wasted no time in taking advantage of the opportunity. Sparks crackled through his gauntlet with what looked to be some kind of electrical sorcery. Within seconds of being released, Vaughan swung his hand toward Tylandra. whipping a shocking tether of lacerated energy that slashed through the pillar that she was hiding behind as though it were soft butter. The whip's momentum never ceased as it sliced right up through half of her left leg and continued to sever her little fingers and part of her hand clean off. Howling in agony, screaming with horror, Tylandra fell to the ground in tears, clenching her hand and leg to her chest. Her wounds had been cauterized by the sorcery, but it didn't stop the excruciating pain. Another wave of sparks crackled around Vaughan's gauntlet as he reared his hands to whip out another beam, looking to finish the job and eliminate the archer girl. He lashed his arm out once more to release his wrath when another tug diverted his spell, flinging it off to the side and saving Tylandra's life. Yet another accursed chain had wrapped around his arm just in the nick of time. Roaring muffled curses from beneath the chain wrapped around his mouth, Vaughan thrashed and writhed in frustration. Doromin had managed to activate another runestone. "This is why I make spares," he quipped, though he was hastily becoming exhausted from having to withstand the might of 2 stones. He was already fatigued from activating and withstanding the sorcery of 1. 2 simultaneously were proving lethal to his stamina. "Tylandra, I can't hold on to both of these," Doromin cried as he struggled. "I need you to take this one whilst I finish setting up the tier." How Tylandra was still even conscious and managed to not go into shock was beyond her comprehension. It was a testament to her will to fight on and take the evil tyrant down once and for all. Though she had sprawled herself across the floor with her own exhaustive injuries, she still reached out with her now good hand to take on the burden of another runestone. It was going to take all that she had to keep the rune's sorcery concentrated on Vaughan. As careful as possible, Doromin placed the stone in her hand, doubly ensuring it remained active as he let it go. He wasn't willing to take any chances. "Hurry it up, spellboy. I don't think this pebble is going to last much longer," Nerigald exclaimed, heavily fatigued as well. He was looking mighty rough and on the precipice of passing out. Writhing with snarls and growls galore, having been held aloft by his neck and arm, Vaughan's eyes were glowing even more intensely with a burning abhorrence. He was infuriated with how he'd let himself be tricked into his current predicament. His internal monologue of self-berating hatred only fueled his rage. "I am the most powerful being in the realm," he thought. "How could I have been so careless, especially with these degenerate plebeians?" But the bright, frenzied flames of his eyes soon dwindled to sparking embers as his rage turned into panic, something that he'd never felt before. He watched helplessly as Doromin procured a certain artifact from his satchel and realized what he had planned. Pulling out a large white crystal, Doromin attached the artifact to it with a piece of twine. A silver skull in the shape of a tear with holes for the eyes, yet a hungry glare. A reaper's tear. Where in the realm did they find a dragon artifact? Vaughan thought. I cannot allow these mortals to wield or use it. Having finished the initial setup, Doromin recited and repeatedly chanted, Xylothar, Sinathar, Devalkis, Nithron, Silveris, Velneris, raising the artifact in one hand and the runestone in the other. Something extraordinary then happened to Vaughan. His body convulsed with violent spasms as 2 giant black spikes shot out from his back, piercing through his armor. Tylandra and Nergalt's eyes widened with awe as the spikes wriggled, cracked, and snapped, unfolding into 2 bony, magnificent draconic wings. Black, hardened scales soon formed over his bones, along with cracked leathery skin weaving into the webbing between them. Are those wings? Asked Nergalt. He has wings. Why does Vaughan have wings? He figured he was just growing delusional after having been thrashed and losing so much stamina to the stone in his hands. With his new draconic appendages formed, the Dark Lord extended them outwards. His wings were so magnificently large that they spanned the full length of the courtyard. He began beating them, flapping them fiercely in an attempt to break the chains and escape the tier's fate. It was a last resort, an act of desperation, but it seemed to be working as Nergalt's runestone cracked and crumbled in his hands. Did we do it? Asked Nergalt in a mindless haze. The runestone had taken its toll on the knight. It wasn't long before he fell backwards, resting unconscious. Vaughan, on the other hand, was grinning with unexpected delight after having his mace and right arm freed from the accursed chains. Opting to drop his weapon, Vaughan summoned sparks of crackling sorcery between the clawed fingers of his gauntlet as before. He reared his arms back, conjuring another burning arcane whip to the end of the folly of his foes once and for all. Throwing his arm forward with pure hatred burning in his eyes, the Dark Lord was suddenly jerked backwards, his hand refusing to follow through with the motion. It was Lashog. She had since subdued the Graglans, and amidst all of the chaos, she'd managed to sneak behind Vaughan just in time to leap up and hang off his arm, restricting it with the might that she had left. "What?" Vaughan snarled, still muffled by the chains. "You pain-in-the-ass fungus freak! Unhand me, Shrog!" He then lifted the War Maiden further off the ground and flailed his arm in such a way that she was slung into the wing and batted across the courtyard. Soaring through the air, Lashog crashed through a stone statue before smashing head first into a stone wall. Thankfully, her Shrorog body wasn't as squishy as that of a human's, and she was able to survive such brutality. Be that as it may, she was still out for the count. With his arms finally free, Vaughan's eyes ignited into flaming fury once more. At last he could eliminate the wizard wannabe and free himself from the treacherous debacle. Alas, when he looked over at the warlock, it was already too late. Doramin had finished the incantation, and the Reaper's tear was hovering off the ground of its own accord, with its ornate silvery eyes fixed upon him. Vaughan summoned sparks of sorcery to his gauntlet anyway, conjuring a massive flail of dark arcane energy to swing down and crush his foe in one last desperate attempt. As the giant spiked ball swung down, it was barely a meter away from obliterating Doramin when it was suddenly relinquished against the Dark Lord's will. Two beams of bright blue hue shot directly into Vaughan's chest, nullifying his ability to wield his arcane power. It was a sorcery of the Reaper's tear lashing out from the eye sockets of the skull. The artifact's power was so potent that the remaining runestones instantly shattered in Doramin and Tylandra's hands, breaking and dispelling the accursed chains that were tethering Vaughan with them. However, the very nature of the Reaper's tear held him in place well enough of its own accord. "You abysmal little bastards! Do you have any idea what you've done?" Vaughan growled. He then howled in pain as his body jolted violently, bending backwards as a stream of dark energy as black as the void flowed out of his chest. It swallowed the blue beams of light until all that was left were streams of pulsating corruption rushing right back through the eyes of the Reaper's tear, filling the white crystal with a misting darkness. The awesome wings that had once sprung forth from Vaughan's back were withering back to how they began. Their scales fell off and their leathery skin crumpled away as the bones painfully retracted back into his torso, breaking like arms being snapped from the pull of an intense vacuum. Vaughan was helpless as the fiery glow from his eyes drained into a dulled abyss, sinking deeper behind the furrowing crevices that were now his eye sockets. It wasn't before all the crystal's radiance had faded into the darkest shade of black as Vaughan's body shriveled, wrinkled, and dried up like a decayed, emaciated corpse. As the final remnants of the Dark Lord's vitality and very soul were snapped from his body, he gave a final whisper with the raspiest echo of his voice. "Your fates are sealed." Fortune was not to shine upon the archer and warlock, however, as a deep crack had formed in the Reaper's tear. It was apparently incapable of withstanding the strain and pressure of siphoning such a powerful soul. The artifact soon crumbled and broke away into shattered pieces from the crystal as it was transferring the last of Vaughan's energy. That tiny smidgen of Vaughan's soul had nowhere to go but to return to his husk. It was barely enough to do anything other than keep him alive, though weakened and unable to move, speak, or summon sorcery. The rest of his life essence had been collected and trapped within the large crystal that oddly remained floating in the air of its own volition. What was once a beautifully white radiant gemstone had since been corrupted into a black abyssal rock with puffs of purple smoke emanating from its surface. Varkon's husk, however, had fallen to the ground, clattering like a heavily armored rag doll cast aside by a child. Limp and lifeless, though still very much alive, he could do nothing but suffer with his internal thoughts. "It's done," said Doromin with a laden breath. "I can't believe we actually done it. Against all odds!" He let out a huge sigh of relief and a slight chuckle. Exhausted, he slapped his arms down to his sides and headed over to check on Tylandra. Struggling to stay conscious, she found it difficult to speak, so instead she reached up, pointing at the crystal as if something were wrong before passing out. Turning to see what she had been pointing at, Doromin saw that the three Graglin had since come to and were hurriedly dragging their defeated master back into the castle. It was only when he realized that one of the scrawnier-looking ones had snatched the crystal that panic and urgency set in. "Oh, no, you don't!" he yelled, stumbling forward to chase after them. Lifting the final spell stick that he'd brought with him from his belt, Doromin snapped it in half, activating the runes that were etched into the wood and channeled a spell of lightning energy to his hand. As chaotic as lightning tends to be, it wasn't the easiest of arcane energies for him to wield. The rune tattoos on his arms began to glow as he manipulated the sorcery to throw at the Graglins. But as it had been raining, a streak of lightning shot down from his finger and into the puddle he had been standing in. Doromin had managed to shock himself just as he was hurling the spell. He still threw a bolt, though, and it was a direct hit, landing on the scrawny Graglin, who had hold of a crystal. Amplified from being soaked in the rain, the intense shock caused the creature to jolt, judder, tumble forward, and release the crystal from his grasp. Shooting a little way into the air, spinning faster and faster, the crystal appeared to have absorbed a great portion of the lightning spell as well. A bright purple glow soon emanated from within its black abyss that was rapidly increasing in radiance, along with its whirling sound that was ramping up into a higher-pitched hum. "Oh, that can't be good," said Doromin. His heart sank and his mouth drooped as he watched with widened, worried eyes. Cracks gradually formed in two different places along the surface and sides of the crystal as it shook violently, jerking and jouncing in different directions. Beams of intense purple light shone through the cracks, and whirling ramped up louder and louder until it was a terrible shriek, as if the crystal was crying out in pain. The cracks grew bigger and the crevices deeper until suddenly the crystal violently burst with an explosive and blinding light of yellow fire and purple sorcery. The crystal had exploded into 3 shards that were flung away from Dryad in separate directions across the realms until they were no longer to be seen with the naked eye. An eerie silence slowly fell upon the courtyard as the pitter-patter of rain returned once more. The Graglin had since disappeared into the castle with their master, leaving only tracks and drag marks in the mud. Whilst his companions remained unconscious in the courtyard, Doromin stayed to watch over them with his jaw firmly dropped in total awe of what had just transpired. Having exhausted his resources of spells and sorcery, there was nothing more Doromin could do. "Well," he sighed, "he didn't come back, so we've got that going for us."